2015, as a year for video games, was a great one, even if it took a little while to get going. It was a year where indie games went toe-to-toe with huge AAA releases, where the massively anticipated games actually met standards, and where player choice grew to resemble something remarkable.
It's probably worth noting that amongst all the lamentations over the pitfalls of modern gaming that you can easily cycle between to suit the argument that gaming is well and truly fucked, we've had some sensational games come out in 2015. There's still a few dark clouds that remind us that these victories come at the occasional cost, but you should still appreciate when some games get it so right, otherwise, what the fuck are we doing? Now, I haven't played every game that came out this year, but my word did I try. In the end, I ran out of time, and there's still a few games that I never got around to, like Nuclear Throne and Beginner's Guide, or games that I didn't play enough of to really have a strong opinion on them, like Xenoblade Chronicles X, but I would say I've got plenty to work with. Same rules as last week's Worst Games of 2015 video, but I should have more positives to say this time. At least you'd hope so. Arguably one of the most important aspects of any competitive multiplayer shooter is player mobility. It can really accentuate the speed of the gameplay if players can zip around the battlefield, and I guess it also raises the skill ceiling by a bit too. This is one of the first things I noticed when we first got a look at Splatoon. Other than the usual, "Hey, Nintendo are making a shooty bang bang game, this can only go well." And actually, it surpassed the very notion of doing well. In the same year that we got another Call of Duty and another Halo game, we also got something as refreshing as Splatoon. And I'm not trying to downplay the efforts of Black Ops 3 or Halo 5 too much, but a game with kid squid shooting ink at each other is probably going to stand out a bit more. At least if you put reputation to one side. Splatoon manages to capture the essence and excitement of a shooter with the kind of kid-friendly aesthetics that you rarely see combined with this genre. Of course, all of this would be in vain if it didn't play well, but thanks to the smoothness of the gameplay, mostly down to switching between kid and squid, keeps everything fast-paced and rewarding. And since Nintendo are keen to support Splatoon, the multiplayer will have a shelf life for as long as Nintendo wants. Might be worth keeping this one going. It's been a while since I've seen a game so polarizing as Batman Arkham Knight, and yet the interesting part is that it came about from an aspect that had very little to do with the actual game. If you played, or at least attempted to play the PC version, you'll likely write it off as a horrendously optimized train wreck ruined further by low quality textures and an inconsistent frame rate. But if you're like me and you bought it for consoles, your experience may well have been very different.
When you release a crappy port of a game, it's very easy to lose sight of what the game is like behind it. It's like trying to appreciate some fine art while blindfolded. You're not helping yourself. But was Arkham Knight worth it when it was working as intended? Yeah, I'd say so.
The biggest strength in the Arkham series was always the combat system, and I saw the plots in those games as an excuse to glide to a new location so I could kick the shit out of a room full of bad guys. And I can say with some confidence that they refined the already insanely polished formula to give the best experience yet. Using the Batmobile so often is a bit of a pain, but I did enjoy most of the time I spent non-lethally obliterating all these tanks. The story could have used a bit more direction, and it would have made my year if Scarecrow was as unpredictable as he is in Arkham Asylum, but it's a fitting finale for the Dark Knight and indeed the Arkham series, and the definitive version of the power fantasy that gamers have grown to love over the last 5 years. Not sure what's next for Batman, but Telltale are planning something for next year. Let's hope they know how to make a PC port. Rocket League is some crazy shit. I've played similar kinds of games or minigames before and they've all felt highly strung, as if any second something absolutely absurd is gonna happen. And yet, somewhere in Rocket League's development there must have been a conversation or a meeting where the game's physics engine was made such a huge priority. Because what we ended up with was a title that feels floaty enough to be fun and impulsive, and yet developed enough to feel less like a dodgy game made with sauce. I haven't played the multiplayer yet because my latency is a sight to behold, but from what I've seen on live streams, this game is one of the best and most addictive multiplayer experiences released this year, and one that is honestly very well balanced for competitive play. There were a few issues with servers not working, but I think this is something that developers Psyonix have now patched. The only real issue I would have is the game's longevity, as you are simply playing a stylized game of football. Sure, you have a fair amount of tricks, flips and boosts to play with, but like every game like this, it'll need a great deal of support to last. I'm sure Twitch will still get plenty out of this. There's something beautiful, maybe even poetic, about 30 years of history behind a big name. All the ups and downs, the different forms that it's taken over the decades, being culminated in a game like Super Mario Maker. Because in that period of time, however much of that you've been alive to witness, the average player will have amassed both experience of playing Mario levels and also an idea how they would like to construct their own Mario level. And so releasing a licensed creation tool with online course sharing and a decent variety of tools at your disposal is one of the best ways to celebrate 30 years of Mario. It's hard really to comment much on the individual aspects of Super Mario Maker's design, as a lot of it, and indeed a lot of the fun you may or may not be having, is down to the people who use it. You could complain that a few key components are missing. Would be fantastic if we got slopes, Nintendo. But it wasn't that long ago that they added checkpoints, so much like with Splatoon, Nintendo are willing to support this one to give it as much of a chance as possible to win people over. And if you have grown tired of waiting for a new 2D Mario game, which probably don't need to happen that often now thanks to this game, then Super Mario Maker will give you that volatile insight into what the fans like in a Mario level. However sadistic and merciless that may be.
Super Mario Maker doesn't diminish the influence of Shigeru Miyamoto or the other original creators by putting you on the same level as them, as you soon find out how difficult it is to properly balance a level, though it may well be the catalyst for the next wave of budding developers.
Every time I think that I'm quite good at games, my self-confidence gets shot out of the sky and I have to emerge from the wreckage with my pride severely dented. By now I can beat parts of Zelda 2 with my eyes closed and Contra is my bitch, but even then, From Software release a new game and back into my shell I go. The primary difference between Dark Souls 1 and 2 and Bloodborne is the amount of refinement that went into the latter's combat. Dark Souls always felt like you were half a step away from everything going terribly wrong, and the same can be said about Bloodborne. What's changed this year is that it feels even more like it's your fault when you mess up, which also means that it feels even more empowering when you get the hang of it. Something I also noticed from Dark Souls to Bloodborne is that I actually gave a shit about the story. Maybe because by this point the novelty of "oh dude, these games are impossible" has worn off a bit, but I found myself really fascinated by the world of Yharnam. The ambience has definitely been cranked up a couple of notches, and suddenly this has shades of genuine horror about it, making you feel even more vulnerable and susceptible to some horrendous creature coming along and ruining your day. It still takes a lot of skill and most importantly of all patience to get the best results, but it shows that From Software are willing to perfect their already pretty successful formula further. Now all I need is to get good at it. Making a game from scratch in 5 months nowadays is impressive, but of course, that didn't happen with Fallout 4. Not that it mattered much, using the framework from Fallout 3 is hardly a bad idea, but what might have been a good idea would have been to iron out some of the discrepancies that existed in the previous game. At some point we start to drift away from Bethesda quirkiness and into slightly more crazy territory. And as I sit here slowly dropping through the world, I'm reminded of the crap new dialogue wheel and the removal of the karma system, and indeed the stronger focus on shooting rather than being an RPG, and I do wonder why I play this game at all.
There are few games like Fallout 4. If you look hard enough, you can find enough bugs, faults, glitches to fill an entire irradiated wasteland, but they surprisingly don't take away from the experience that much. You can focus on them too much and lament their poor integration, but for me at least, they're quite easy to just tune out. Not many games can do that.
I think what I'm trying to say is that despite all that's wrong, or at the very least questionable about Fallout 4, I could barely put it down. It's certainly an excellent game if your expectations weren't outstandingly high like most of the internet, but that's not to do what the game does right a disservice. The stronger emphasis on gunplay may have been detrimental to the role-playing, but shooting has a real kick to it and VATS help to accentuate this further. It takes away a bit of fear, especially when you're strolling around in power armor so much, but it lets you really take in the wonders of the Commonwealth, which might not be as big as the last game, but you can tell that more effort went into it as you soak up the atmosphere. I'd question how the world will see Fallout 4 in a decade's time, but for all the streamlining and compromise that this game makes, it still remains a thoroughly enjoyable and engrossing experience. Even making this video now, I feel a longing to return to Fallout 4. It just has that power. Some games developers and publishers had a particularly bad 2015 due to releasing poor games or making misguided decisions, and yet it was Konami who became the publishing equivalent of a supervillain. Every other week there was news filtering through that Konami were taking more steps in their efforts towards spectacular self-destruction, and yet from the raging fire came a silver lining. Metal Gear's swan song. I was cautiously optimistic with Metal Gear Solid 5 The Phantom Pain, but those fears were never truly justified, especially when you take your first wander through a hostile camp. The sheer number of options you have for taking down bad guys and infiltrating the enemy lines is genuinely staggering, and I was finding new ways of getting things done a good month after the game came out. While the gameplay is outstanding and gave me the kind of freedom that I've scarcely encountered in an open world game, it came at the cost of the story. I mean, it starts well, but it doesn't really do anything. Especially Chapter 2 and the eventual ending that just kind of happens. Then you hear that the game wasn't actually finished and that there was at least one extra chapter missing, and it's hard for all of that to not taint the experience a bit. Or maybe we're supposed to feel the pain of what isn't there. The phantom pain, if you like. Hideo Kojima is either operating at a much higher plane than the rest of us, or he's even more pretentious than first thought. Either way, Kojima Productions are back on their feet now, and I think Konami have given up on publishing games, so there's a happy ending after all.
There's an age-old tug-of-war between expectations and reality. It's kind of why I don't frequent the hype train anymore. The world becomes a lot more enjoyable when you immediately think everything's gonna be shit. And of course, I saw Ori and the Blind Forest and thought it was gonna be a classic case of pretty visuals hiding shallow gameplay. I couldn't have been more wrong.
It's very easy to slip into the Metroidvania obsessives crowd and drool over any game that uses these kind of mechanics, but there was something in the early stages of playing Ori and the Blind Forest that signified that this game wasn't going to sit back on what effectively amounts to mechanical nostalgia. By comparison, while Axiom Verge felt very much like a love letter to exploratory 2D platformers, Ori and the Blind Forest pushed beyond that and became its own thing. The visuals are strikingly beautiful, but I never felt like it carried the game through difficult moments. Mostly because it never needed to. Though of course, like some of the harder Metroidvania titles, this game gets tricky fast. There's a few of these chase sequences where you're given a checkpoint at the start and then expected to leap through these perilous set pieces, but that's frankly as hard as it gets outside of the game's finale. Though that achievement about going through the game without dying once can fuck right off. It really could have used a fast travel system, but at least you get a chance to backtrack through some of these breathtaking levels and put to use some of your newfound abilities. And since you can make save points as you go, it never becomes truly frustrating. You'd hate to rage quit from a game that looks like this. AAA games had a very mixed 2015. Some games hit their marks, like Bloodborne and Fallout 4. Some didn't quite hit the heights that people might have expected, like Star Wars Battlefront and Mario Party 10, and some fell so hard on their faces that people are still trying to reconstruct what remains of Tony Hawk 5. For me, there was one game that really stood above the rest, that took an open world setting and laced enough quality through it that it very rarely felt thin. Somehow The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt got virtually everything right. One of my main issues with open world games is that they either don't fill the space, or fill the space with things to do that no one would ever want to do. And yet The Witcher 3 manages to strike a really impressive compromise between giving you space to take in the world around you, and giving you a ton of quests to find as you explore. As a newcomer to the series, I was ecstatic to see how the game handles tutorials in such a fluid manner. Not just letting players skip them, but not forcing any down your throat. And then there's a brilliantly interweaving story backed up by rewarding combat, and I find myself wanting to play a lot more of it. Which sadly I didn't, because it didn't take long to convince me that this game was a little special, but after this, you'll never hear from me again. I really tried with this one. I foresaw a scenario where I'd be putting Undertale at the top of a best games of 2015 video, but I wanted to make sure that it deserved it, rather than blindly praising it because lol, skeletons are funny. If you haven't spent the last 4 months of the year with your head buried deep underground, you'll know the impact that this game has had on both the people who played it and obviously the internet. Is it the best game of all time? Definitely not, but is it the best game of 2015? You know, it might be. Every now and again I feel like we need a game like Undertale to come along and remind us what video games can be. This is hardly the formula that all games should follow, as it does get away with low expectations and simple graphics due to its status as an indie game, but if one guy can think up a battle system this engaging and weave gameplay so expertly into the narrative with maybe the best soundtrack of the year, then why shouldn't it be considered amongst the elite for 2015? It may look like the passing fad of the moment if you take a trip to Tumblr, but I genuinely believe there is enough substance and features working in the background for Undertale to remain a favourite for years to come. Again, not the best game of all time, but easily one of the most self-confident.
This has been RabbidLuigi, and with a lot of the games released this year, there seemed to be something holding them back, an additional factor that stopped them from being amazing or near perfect. It's kind of the thing you have to get used to with AAA releases, that it's going to be very hard to get everything right. And yet with Undertale, there were no buts.
Hey guys, thanks for watching, and indeed, thank you for joining me this year. It's been a year where lots has happened, and I've made more videos than I ever thought, and I just want to thank all of you for putting up with me during that time. I have plans to take January off from making countdowns just so I can get a few other things done, and to also prevent any kind of burnout. You never know, I might be back sooner if I get everything done, but in the meantime, you know where to find me. Thanks for all your help this year, and I will see all of you in 2016.